Welcome back everyone to more NASCAR Heat 3 coverage here at Knee Pit Gaming. Today's setup video takes us back to the dirt with Taggart County Motorplex. Now this is an interesting track, a little bit different than what we've looked at in the past for our setups at places like Charlotte or Eldora. This is a very wide track, very wide sweeping corners, particularly on the entry and the exit. So if you get those right, you can really run some fast lap times. We're going to be looking at a setup that I used to get the 105 speed rating. Actually, I used multiple setups here at this track, and they all worked pretty good. Ultimately, I had to choose one, but we'll talk about, when we get to the setup itself, some adjustments that I had made and also ran very good laps with. You can see I've run 16 races with 13 wins. If you haven't had a chance already, go ahead and check out the gameplay video from Taggart that I uploaded a little bit earlier today. I would love to run longer gameplay videos than the 13 laps I did this time, but even at the maximum difficulty, I was lapping cars by lap 10 or 11 into that race. So continuing on, I would have simply just lapped the entire field all the way up to second place after several more laps. So I cut it down to 13 laps, because I just wanted to show you some of the basic lines that I try to run as I move around the track a little bit and vary my entry and my exit on the corners, just trying to see what works and what doesn't. So we're going to be taking a look at the setup itself. We're going to be taking a look at lap times and lines around the track. So let's get to it. All right, before we get too deep into the setup itself, let's talk a little bit about lap times. As I mentioned in the intro, the AI unfortunately are not all that quick here. So once you get any sort of speed in the car and get up around a 103 or 104 rating, you're going to be plenty fast to beat the AI. In qualifying, the AI on the pole is generally somewhere around a 17.4. Sometimes they're a little quicker than that, but 17.4, 17.5, anywhere in that range, and you'll be perfectly fine on qualifying. I generally actually don't do quite that well on qualifying. I'm usually in the 17.5s or 6s in qualifying and don't run my faster laps until the actual race. But my quicker laps here in the 17.3s, there's more speed to be had here, but because the AI just aren't competitive and I already had the 105 rating, I just stopped working on things. And as I mentioned in the intro, there are a few different setups that I used here and had a lot of success with. It just depends on how you want to attack the track. Specifically, how you want to do the entry to the corners and the exit to the corners, because how you decide to do those. Do you want to make wider arcs into and off the corners, or do you want to try to pinch it off more and run a little bit lower, straighter entry into the corner? That's going to dictate how you set up the car. So a setup that works really good for a wide entry may not work quite as well for a straighter entry and exit off the corner. So keep that in mind as we talk about this. As always, I'm going to skip over the shocks because that is really beyond the scope of these particular videos. You could do entire series on nothing but the shocks, but the 3-5 setup with the bump and rebound has worked well for me. But as always, test that out for yourself and see what works best for you. Moving on to the weight settings, we want maximum left side weight, of course, since we're on an oval. Front weight and wedge, this is where we're going to see a lot of similarities between this setup and what I ran at the Charlotte Dirt. Actually, using the exact setup from Charlotte Dirt works really well here. I decided to make some tweaks based on how I wanted to drive the car, and that just came from turning laps. I finally decided on how I wanted to do the entry and the exit to the corner, and I wanted the car to rotate a little bit quicker, and that's why you see the wedge number is at 48.5 as opposed to being a little bit higher than that. The slower the rotation you want in the car, you want to increase that wedge. If the car is rotating too quickly and getting loose, that's going to scrub off speed, so then you want to adjust your wedge for that. Another way to adjust particularly the entry to the corner and how quickly you want the car to turn is with that right front spring. I like using the maximum left front spring. It just has a good feel, but of course you can always use much softer springs as well. But for me, 280 on the left front, 220 on the right front. If you need a little bit of help on corner entry, go back to your wedge number, maybe lower that a little bit, or the right front spring, maybe lower that a little bit as well. And the inverse is also true. If you're getting too loose on entry, then you could take a look at increasing that wedge or maybe upping that right front spring a little bit. In the rear of the car, that's really where I try to tune the exit of the corner and the center of the corner. Here I've gone with the 220 and 260 in the rear, but I've also had great results using 280 in both of the rear springs. That also worked well for really good laps. But again, it's all about how you adjust your driving to the setup. Tire settings, 23, 24 pounds on the left side, maximum on the right sides. But again, that's certainly not anything you can't play with. There's plenty of adjustability there as well. Miscellaneous settings were maximum camber on both front tires. Front sway bar is at 1.1. If you are finding that the car is just too loose overall, you're scrubbing off too much speed from getting sideways, then one of the options you have is increasing that front sway bar and make the front end just a little bit stiffer side to side as far as the weight transfer, and that can help stabilize the car, particularly on entry and through the center. I'm not using the rear sway bar. The track bar is at 12 inches on both sides, and this is a great tool. In fact, you can make great setups using no adjustments other than the wedge and the track bar, really, on these cars if you find some spring settings that you like. 12 inches on the rear track bar seems to work out best for me. If I get it too much higher than that, the rear end wants to drive the car more than I would like. And if I get lower than that, the car doesn't rotate quite as nicely as I would prefer on corner entry. So 12 inches seems to be a good number there. Brake buys, I really don't use the brakes here. When I'm in traffic particularly, I simply just lift off the throttle a little bit more to make sure I can keep it on the bottom. The AI cars will give you the bottom, the extreme bottom that is, particularly on entry. So as long as you can stay down there, brakes really aren't needed all that much. But if you decide you want to use that a little bit for the entry of the corner, then anywhere from 45 to 55% on the brake buys seems to work pretty good for me. But of course, if you want the car to rotate more under the brakes, then you want to reduce the brake buys. And if the car is a little bit too loose on the brakes, then you want to increase that brake buys. Not running any grill tape. Wheel lock is at 20 degrees. I've had luck running all the way up to the maximum of 35. Again, it just depends on how you want to drive the car and how quick do you want the steering to be. Steering offset is at 0.05, and that is simply to offset the pull to the left somewhat from our front camber settings. Gear settings, this is another place you have a lot of adjustability. On the rear end ratio, I'm at 4.5, but you can certainly play around with that and turn more or less RPMs. If the more RPMs you turn, increasing this number from 4.5 to into the 4.6s or 7s, you'll turn more RPMs and the car will generally be looser, particularly on the entry, on the exit. If you lower this number from 4.5 to maybe 4.33, something along those lines, then you're going to get fewer RPMs and the car is generally going to be tighter, particularly on exit to the corner. One more word to say about how you drive this track. Again, go to the gameplay video if you want to see sort of how I do it. There's many different ways of doing it, but you can run this track wide open, and really you can do that with any of the dirt tracks in the game, but that's not always the fastest way for me to get around the track. So what you're going to see in the gameplay is me not running the track wide open. What I like to do is on entry, I like to lift just real quickly to maybe half throttle, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, depending on how the car is handling for me right then, how deep I've driven it into the corner and so on. I try to get the car pointed toward the center and prepared for the exit, and then I'm right back into the gas. You can accomplish the same thing without lifting, but it just feels more natural for me to get the car adjusted and settled by a quick lift of the throttle. But again, your results will vary, and if you want to run it wide open, you can certainly do that at this and all of the tracks really in the game. So keep that in mind. Thank you very much for joining me. Hope this will help you in setting up your own car to make the most of Taggart. And stay tuned for more NASCAR Heat 3 coverage here at Knee Pit Gaming.